My guest today is Robin Hanson, Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University. His second book is Elephant in the Brain, The Hidden Motives of Everyday Life with Kevin Simler, which we'll be discussing on today's show. Robin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So to get right to the point, I guess, at first, what is the elephant in the brain?
The elephant in the brain is the thing I most wish I would have known when I started my career in social science. It's the fact that we don't like to notice that we have pretty selfish motives. That might sound trite and trivial, and of course we know that, and we do in a sense, but in another bigger sense, we really don't. So we social scientists, and economists in particular, when we study an area like education or medicine or politics, we listen to what people say about why they do it, like they go to school to learn the material, or they go to the doctor to get healthier, or they participate in politics to produce better policy. And we tend to just assume that they're right about that basic motive, and then we spin more elaborate analyses and models to try to make sense of a lot of things from that point of view. And we often just struggle to figure out what's going on because there's just a lot of puzzles from that point of view. And to me, this biggest insight is the idea that we're often just lying to ourselves and other people about why we do these things. And if we'll just entertain other hypotheses for what the main reason, the main motive for doing these things is, a lot of these puzzles make a lot more sense.
I think that self-deception is an incredibly deep idea, or maybe an important idea in everyday life. And I'm going to come back to that probably a few times over the course of the conversation. But I wanted to come to sort of rewind a little bit here and ask a question about the beginnings of your career. You said, as you mentioned, you wish you knew it when you started studying social science. I read somewhere or heard somewhere maybe that the impetus for you, or the catalyst for you getting into social science, was that you observed that people didn't just disagree on analysis and conclusions, but they also would disagree on facts, which is something that should be immutable. It shouldn't change. I'm wondering if this story is accurate. Is it close to the truth? How did you get into social science?
Well, the way I tell this story is that I was in computer science and physics, and I noticed that many innovations appear in those areas. Then people work hard to find new, slightly better ways of organizing computers or creating physical devices. But that when people do find things that seem to be somewhat better, there's a lot of interest. It's pretty easy to get people interested in looking at and even adopting new, better physical devices or computer organizations. And then when I started to look at social science, I started to seem to find a lot of easy ways to make things a lot better. It seemed to be easy hunting ground. You could just look at a area of human behavior like medicine or law and analyze it for a little bit and seem to identify big wins, ways that we could all be a lot better. And that was exciting for me. And so naive me, I didn't ask why it seemed to be so easy to find such things. I just assumed I must be brilliant or something, and started going into those areas. And I think on reflection, the reason it's so easy to find big wins in social science is because it's so hard to get anybody to adopt them. If it were easy to get people to adopt them, these big wins would already be gone. People would have adopted them, and then we'd be much farther down the diminishing returns schedule and looking at the scraps of things that were left. But we're not, because it's so hard to get people to even adopt the most basic insights about how to do things better. So that's, I would say, that raises a puzzle. Why is it that people are so uninterested in all these big wins? And that's part of what the elephant in the brain, I think, helps answer.
One of the things that really intrigued me about going through your website in preparation for the interview, your homepage, and it said that you listed yourself as an extrovert, which is fascinating to me, and that suggests to me that you weren't shy about discussing these ideas, and I saw that you actually started a mailing list as well about designing new institutions, and so you obviously spent a lot of time advocating for these ideas, or at least trying to discuss these ideas with them. I'm wondering if you could share an early experience of when you kind of walked into a conversation thinking that this was going to be a great idea and somebody's going to be enthusiastic and meet you on the idea plane, but actually just got totally shut out.
I don't know that it works like being shut out exactly. First, initially I was nobody with no contacts or credentials. And so it was sort of obvious that if I said things to people I would have to say them to my friends because nobody else would listen. And so it took me a while until I had the context credentials and still found that people weren't interested, that I got more puzzled. So eventually, even when I teach classes or give talks, I think people will, if they're polite and reasonably intelligent, they'll nod and say, that sounds interesting, that sounds promising. But there's just very little emotional energy there. And as soon as they are distracted by something else, their interest disappears. And so I think it's less about resistance and just about a lack of motivation. People just don't care.
Yeah, there's another idea here that kind of popped into my head. I wonder what you think. I'm wondering whether there's more of a link between, call it, your pre-social science career and your social science career than might be immediately kind of obvious. In that, I saw that you wrote papers on Bayesian statistics, which in some ways is modeling disagreement, and I know you've done some work on actually modeling disagreement with Bayesian statistics. And AI research in some ways is about figuring out what are the weird things that human beings do that allow them to be human, and trying to design machines. In order to design a machine that does it, of course, you have to understand it. And maybe the most human thing of all is this self-deception idea, which you wrote in your book. Are all these things linked? Is there some kind of common thread through that I'm picking up on, or is that my imagination?
Well, I mean, reality is unified at a basic level. So learning about rationality, Bayesian analysis, and artificial intelligence does prepare you to at least have a good model of what an ideal mind would look like, and you can plug that model into economic models to ask what would a world with that mind be like if we make some other assumptions. So if somebody hadn't had that training in Bayesian statistics or artificial intelligence, they would have been more susceptible, I think, to arguments people might make that, these simple models of rationality are unrealistic, and therefore these other more complicated models will answer the questions. In fact, they don't.
And that, there's another important idea here, which is, why you? How is it that you were suited to be able to dig into these problems and recognize them, or at least maybe pursue them farther than somebody else might? Is it that training, the interdisciplinary training, that so often I think is the source of creativity when people take ideas from one field and bring them to another? Is that the secret sauce?
Well, there's some element of that, but honestly, I think what I've learned over the years is the kinds of things I've discovered and I'm willing to tell people are things that smart people have known for centuries. They're just usually smart enough or socially savvy enough not to say them out loud, at least in public, because that's usually not very effective for their social strategies. So if I'm being unique, I'm more in saying this out loud very publicly in a way that's less, going to get me personal friends and influence people, and more academically trying to say that, look, this is something at least some of us social scientists should be paying attention to, more formally and directly.
It's funny because I remember there's one, maybe the first reference I came about you online. I saw about you that I came across online was on Tyler Cowen's blog Marginal Evolution, where he talked about your a theory of ethics. I think he said called dealism, which you advocated for, and he made some kind of, I think, probably tongue-in-cheek comment about how in real life you have a sort of different way of behaving, which in his mind I think that he genuinely believes that you do value friendship and social cohesion in a certain kind of way, although you're no shrinking violet when it comes to disagreement. So is it that you're okay with alienating people, or is it that there's something else going on there which you actually feel like you can just convince them given enough time?
Well, so it just so happens that I had to go take a sexual harassment seminar today, not because of anything particular I've done, of course, just because it's a regular requirement here. And, some people I know, it was mentioned, like to sort of, pick fights, ask about complicating questions. And I said, well, that's not me. I'd happy to argue with somebody who wants to argue with me. I'd love to, like the sport of it, but I'm not going to jump all over someone. It's just their job to be doing a seminar. So I am, I value friendship and politeness, and, in the right sort of context, you should not pick fights. And expose things that people would find awkward to be exposed. But in the intellectual world, where to some extent we've kind of agreed that this is where we're supposed to bring up big ideas and challenge other people's claims, I'm happy to do that when it seems the right thing to do.
And there's another work that you put together where you called yourself or made reference to a concept of a reluctant disagreeer, and I'm going to ask you for your reflection on what that means. From what I could see, it seems to me that there's this underlying optimism that disagreement is actually kind of an illusion, when if we can just talk about it long enough, we'll figure out what it is that we think we're disagreeing about it, and maybe it isn't much, and it's simply miscommunication. Is that right? How do you think about that?
Well, I would flip it around and say, if we think about conversation and disagreement, we have a story we tell ourselves about why it happens. And again, that's a relatively flattering story. And the elephant in our brain, there as elsewhere, is the fact that we're actually being driven by much more selfish motives than we want to admit. So, and this is when we disagree. So we usually like to think that, well, the world's a complicated place and we each have our own different analysis, but we each need to be faithful to our analysis and information. And that's why we disagree, because we just, it takes a while to understand where somebody else is coming from and what their point of view is. And until we do, we need to sincerely and authentically stay true to our personal analysis. And therefore, and because we're talking just so that we can help the world and everybody understand, then that's why we disagree, but it's all in good faith and honest misunderstandings. I think that's just wrong. That is, when we analyze ideal Bayesian agents and ideal agents in many ways, and also when we look at other animals, like even bumblebees, we find that they don't disagree much, because even though they don't know the details of each other's reasoning, they quite reasonably presume that there are details and that you don't need those details to hear somebody's summary opinion and have it weigh heavily on yours. And so, in fact, ideal rational agents would not knowingly disagree. That is, if I'm about to tell you something and I know what you think, I shouldn't be able to expect to predict the direction in which you will disagree in the future from what I'm about to tell you. That is, there should be some disagreement, because you'll also know things that I don't know, but on average, I expect you to agree with me. And that's just a consistent thing I can prove and can do lab experiments to show. And it's also, again, true of other animals who aren't as social as humans, but humans are different. And plausibly that's because humans are actually not that interested in being accurate compared to showing our autonomy and our creativity and defiance and our allegiances, etc. That is, most of ordinary conversation, the beliefs that we express there, are much more to do with these other sort of social functions of our beliefs.
So the idea there, I guess, being that disagreement is driven by other agendas, which are the hidden motivations. There's one I don't know, call it framework, that I was expecting to see in the book that I didn't see, which is something you've written about a lot, which is Nearfar bias. And so the idea there, a different framing of what disagreement is that people are looking at the world in kind of an abstract way or in a highly detailed way. I'm wondering if what you think of that framework now. I think it's been a little while, maybe since I've seen you write on it. If you still hold that in high esteem.
I still think it's a powerful framework, and I try to use it whenever I can. I just haven't been writing as much about it because I've been doing other things. It's a powerful framework. It helps you understand a number of things. It's not at the core of the elephant in the brain and our self-deception about our motives, though, but it does help us understand how we can be sort of very naturally hypocritical. So one way in which we are hypocritical is that we apply different standards to other people than to ourselves. And you might think we'd have to kind of know that we're doing that in order to do that. But in fact, the way it works is that when we think about ourselves at this moment, when we're acting, we are in this very near mode. And in near mode, we're very practically oriented. We have some theories, but we believe everything's very complicated. And in terms of goals, we're focused more on practical constraints and low-level goals rather than high-level goals. On the other hand, when we think about other people at other times and places, far away from here, then we switch into far mode. And in far mode, we have more confidence in our theories. We think detail matters less. We make more predictions based on just a few features about people. And when we think about goals, we are focused on very high-level goals as opposed to low-level constraints. And at that high-level goal level, we're focused on our basic fundamental principles. And so when we focus on other people doing things at other times and places, we are much less tolerant of deviations from what we think are simple moral principles. We are indignant that people in other times and places wouldn't follow the simple rules that would make sense to us, even though, in fact, when we are confronted with situations like that, we focus on all the detail. That means things are complicated and it's hard to judge, and therefore we should be excused from simple-minded applications of these moral principles.
And so I guess that the far bias allows for us to, how does it interact with the hidden motives? Does that allow us to only completely ignore hidden motivations? Is that kind of the mechanism that they link together, or is there something else?
Well, regarding our personal behavior, we will more likely just act on our real motives, especially when we aren't being very heavily watched. But when we start to think about other people or even ourselves at other times and places, we more tend to talk in terms of the kinds of values we would like to pretend to have. And we tend to presume that we have those values and that we apply them to other people. We don't really even notice the difference between the values that we like to pretend to have and the values we actually have that drive our actual behavior. And that's the hidden elephant in the brain, the fact that we just don't notice how selfish we are.
The ultimate example, I guess, of the kind of the far bias being kind of when people think about the future, and I feel compelled to mention your first book here, The Age of M, which is short for emulations, and that's a real kind of tour of a science fiction reality, but one where, if I'm right, you're trying to apply kind of near thinking about what a future world would look like. Maybe just for a second, talk a little bit about what that. How that works, what that book is about.
Yeah, so the idea is just to take a very specific technology scenario that people have talked about a lot in science fiction and futurism, and just sit down and try to apply very methodically all the social science and human sciences and even physical sciences I know to that scenario to say a lot about what would actually happen. And the major meta claim is that you can say a lot. People often think about these future scenarios and they assume that you couldn't really work out what would happen. That's just impossible. And a lot of people who do that are basically physical sciences or computer scientists who don't really believe that social science exists. And so this is partly I'm trying to demonstrate that social science does exist and we do know a lot. And let me show you just how much we can say about a concrete scenario. And I hope to inspire other people then to take other scenarios and try to work it out to as much depth. Now, the scenario I'm focused on isn't obviously going to happen. But it's likely enough that it's worth working out. If say it's worth having 100 books in the future, it's worth having a book on a scenario that has only a 1% chance. And I think this at least meets that. But in that book, I didn't really focus much on hypocrisy or self-deception, although it's there implicitly if you look at it. I was more just in each section trying to take our standard view of that phenomena and just apply it to the scenario. And I think I managed to do that.
One of the ideas which I think links the two books together, if only a little bit loosely, was one which cuts the idea of why do we self-deceive, and the underlying I'll have you comment on this, of course, in a second, but the underlying idea here being humans are vastly more intelligent than other living beings, and so there's this trend of development of humans and of resulting development in the economy. And I love there's a graph in the book which talks about brain volume increases and how it's kind of, if I'm right in looking at it, looks like it accelerates. Maybe you can talk a little bit about why we self-deceive or why we deceive at all.
Well, we're talking about the elephant in the brain, and the basic fact is that the animals with the largest brains on the planet seem to mostly have large brains because of a complicated social environment. It's not that they need big brains to learn how to swim well or hunt well or to run. It's mostly about being in complicated social worlds. And in complicated social worlds, you have to be able to judge who's your friend and who's your enemy. and who knows what about who, and be able to go along with what somebody says if you know what they're thinking and what do they think about somebody else, etc. And that's all very complicated. And so plausibly, that's the main reason our ancestors and ourselves have large brains. It's about the social world. Now, in social worlds, it can be valuable for you to deceive yourself. That's the main reason it's valuable to deceive yourself about anything, is that by deceiving yourself, you can deceive other people, because other people are looking at you and trying to judge what you think and what you believe. And so, for example, if you're a salesperson and you're trying to convince people that you have a good product, often one of the best ways to convince other people it's a good product is to convince yourself it's a good product and to seem to sincerely believe in your product. And so we are trying to sincerely believe in ourselves and our motives, and that's one of the main reasons we deceive ourselves about our motives, so that if somebody accuses us of having a low motive, we can be indignant and outraged that how could anybody dare think of such a thing, because we don't see that when we look at ourselves.
What good did it do us? So social, obviously, right now it's such an enormous part of human existence, social life. So, but it's not obviously, kind of from an evolutionary perspective, a good idea, or necessarily, right? I mean, what did it give us as a species, this social life?
Well, there are a lot of other effects of having big brains, and for humans, we've been spectacularly successful because of that. Humans allowed a cultural evolution whereby individuals can learn during their lives certain practices, and then other people can watch them and copy them. And that cultural accumulation is enormously valuable. It's one of basically the main reason why we're now powerful and rich compared to what we were a million years ago. But that apparently isn't the main reason we had the big brains. It's more of a side effect, but it's a very powerful side effect.
And the reason the big brains is to allow us to coordinate. And I don't think you put this graph in your book, but the brain development it coincided with, or caused, let's say, I think we can be comfortable saying that, enormous increases in living standards, well-being, economic growth. There's these, back to kind of the links between this and the age of EM, transitions in economic growth to do with our ability to, I guess, develop basic technology and then coordinate farming. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, the context of evolutionary history in human development.
Well, I mean, the most obvious fact is that humans started out looking a lot like most other animals, and now we look enormously different. Humanity as a whole, our civilization is now huge in influence, and at the rates we've been going, we'll relatively soon dominate the whole world and even perhaps displace the rest of the biosphere. So clearly something huge is going on, and clearly our brains are part of that. And so we often previously assumed, because we are so powerful and successful and we have these big brains, surely we had the big brains in order to produce the success. And the surprising fact is that it seems that that's not it. We actually had the big brains in order to manage these large, complicated social worlds. Now, an interesting fact about our big brains is that, say, chimpanzees, they have very complicated politics, Machiavellian politics, if you will, but it's very out in the open and overt. But the big changes that humans had compared to other primates were we developed weapons and we developed language. And through these, we could enforce social norms, and social norms could allow a lot more egalitarian treatment, that we shared food and treated each other equally and didn't beat on each other. And if we had just consistently enforced these norms, that should have taken away a lot of the need for the big brains, at least beyond being able to manage weapons and language. Yet we have the biggest brains of all, so there's a disconnect there. How is it that our invention of weapons and language allowed us to apparently take away most of the advantages of Machiavellian politics? That is, in a forager group, that you aren't supposed to create subgroups, you aren't supposed to beat on each other, you aren't supposed to take advantage of the other people via your weapons or something. And on the surface, it does look like that. They are treating each other equally and fairly. Nevertheless, they shouldn't need those huge brains if that were true. And that's a big clue to the elephant in the brain, hypocrisy. That is, in fact, there's a lot going on just below the surface.
And eventually coordinating on larger societies than tribal societies. And what's the link there? Like, what happens to get us to transition from these tribes in the jungle, foragers, and to becoming farmers? It's a different Is that also a byproduct, our ability to do that, to actually coordinate on humongous scales?
Well, once farming became possible, it was only possible because of human cultural plasticity. If we had just kept the same sort of norms and behaviors we had as foragers, we would still be acting a lot like animals in a world where when we did what roughly felt natural, it would be roughly the right thing to do. But with our cultural plasticity, we could create new norms and enforce them and tell ourselves that there was a new set of behavior that was the right behavior and a new set of things that were the wrong sort of norm violating behavior. And it took a while, but farming world was able to come up with a whole new set of norms and values and enforce those. And that allowed us to live and work in a very different world where instead of wandering around, we stayed in one place. Instead of egalitarianly sharing, we had property and inequality. Instead of, intermittent violence, but mostly peace, we had war and a lot of it. And we had technology and specialization and just so many things that were different from what foragers did. And, all of this is because we had cultural plasticity, the ability to invent new norms and to follow them, which is great. But of course, again, we still inherited this habit of pretending to have some motives when we really had others. And so even farmers were not that self-aware about why they did a lot of things.
One thing that has struck me, just being somebody who lives in North America in the last, I don't know, half century or something, that there does seem to be a kind of direction of cultural development, right? So it doesn't feel random. So, there's there's an idea that comes from Kevin Kelly. I don't know if you know that author's book, What Technology Wants, where there's actually, it's called this emergent direction for where technology is developing. Is there an idea, equivalent idea in culture, like what culture wants? Are we going in a particular direction? And is that?
Well, sure. I think there's two main large-scale trends over the last few centuries. One is this trend of increasing technology. That is, nobody's driving the technology train. There's just lots of people all over the world who try to invent new technologies, and then whenever they do, they adopt it if they locally like the consequences, even if the rest of the world doesn't. So the trend in technology has just been to invent more things and adopt them regardless of who anywhere likes it or not. That's the basic technology trend, and that's, of course, producing a wealth trend, making us rich. And in the last few centuries, that trend has been so strong that it's been faster than the rate at which we grow the population, and so there's been an increase in wealth per person. That wasn't true before a few centuries ago, even though we were increasing technology. It was so slow that population could keep up. But lately, wealth has been dramatically increasing per person, and that's the other big trend, I'd say, over the last few centuries. And that's what's causing most of the cultural trends I think you see. So humans just are primed to act differently when they're rich than when they're poor for many good reasons. And we're just seeing that laid out in many parts of society. So I think that's an explanation for why we have increased leisure, increased art, increased travel, decreased violence, increased democracy, decreased fertility, decreased religion. Just a wide range of trends over the last couple of centuries, I think, can be explained because we're getting rich.
And yet, another thread. I mean, it's going to become clear to the listener how many different areas you cover in a lot of your thinking and writing. So another area that I found so interesting in your writing was the idea of farmer and forager. And so one of the developments, I suppose, or another way of framing the development, is that we're reverting to something more like a forager lifestyle as we become wealthy. What's interesting about that, given that your point there about us being wealthier, we're actually starting to emulate the poorest societies of all, being the prehistorical societies. Is that just sort of an accidental irony, or how should we think about that?
That's the cause. That is, when we turned foragers into farmers, we did it through a lot of pretty strong social pressures, conformity pressures, religious threats, etc. And those pressures were mediated a lot by poverty and death. That is, centuries ago, if you told a young woman that if she had a child out of wedlock, she and her child might starve, that was a credible threat, and she might well have seen other cases like that in the world around her. Today, if you tell a young woman that she won't believe it correctly, because she will in fact see many other young women around her who do okay having a child out of wedlock. And so that having children out of wedlock is much more a forager-like thing to do. It was greatly discouraged in the farming world because of the poverty and real threats of that society norm enforcement. And today those threats aren't there. And so that's the main reason why we've drifted back in the forager direction. The forager values and attitudes are the kind of thing that feels natural when we just look inside ourselves without any sort of external considerations. But in the farming world, they made sure they paid attention to a lot of external considerations, and that was persuasive then.
And so is it the case that foragers then are in some ways wealthy? I mean, I don't know how you would define poverty and wealth.
Yes. I mean, many anthropologists a couple of decades ago called them the original affluent society. Now, they're affluent in some ways, but not others. They have a lot of free time. That is, they only work a modest number of hours a day. They don't have a lot of material wealth, but they have a lot of friendship and respect and play and fun and dance and music. And they don't have that much organized violence in terms of war. And so all those things are great for foragers. And of course, they're also living in a world where, again, when they do something that feels right, it roughly works. Even if they're relatively promiscuous, it's okay for foragers to be promiscuous, that they're being roughly the amount of promiscuous that works for them. But us, we're being rich, going back to that, in our leisure time, but at work we're not. So we are more schizoid. At work, we're really hyper farmers. We actually put up with more domination and ranking and being told what to do than most farmers ever would. I mean, farmers had to work pretty hard, but they mostly didn't have a boss hanging over them telling them what to do. Most farming workers were relatively independent people who, after an early period where they learned the job, could mostly do the job according to their own judgment through most of their life. So we are foragers in our leisure time and not at work.
And to kind of come back to the book for a second, when people are buying healthcare, are they really trying to get some of those social benefits of the forager society, but dressing it up as some kind of health benefit? And by forager benefits, I mean, they're looking to be made to feel better psychologically about their condition, as opposed to be made actually healthier.
Well, they're acting out instincts that go all the way back to the forager era. They aren't necessarily thinking about it different. I mean, when foragers get sick, they take care of each other, and some of that is useful for foragers. But even for foragers, a lot of that is showing that they care about each other. They get a strong sense of reassurance when they're sick and in need, and other people will stop and help them and protect them. That's very touching to a forager, and it's still very touching to us. The problem is we are vastly richer, and we can afford a lot more medicine. And so we spend a lot more on medicine in order to show each other that we care, but most of that, at least half of that, is actually hardly useful. And so we could spend a lot less on medicine and have about the same health effect, but we do it to show that we care.
Do you mind just sort of talking about the RAND study that was so
So the claim
powerful?
I just made is surprising. It's one of the more surprising claims I think many people will read in the book. And this is a fact about the elephant in the brain. Our awareness of our hidden motives varies from topic to topic, and if you like, we can go into why. But in medicine, it's one of the most extreme. People are just not at all aware that they aren't actually mostly buying medicine for each other in order to make each other healthy, because that actually doesn't happen. So we have a lot of data about medicine, of course, but some of our best data is randomized experiments. And the random experiment was one of our best randomized experiments in medicine, and that happened back in the 1970s. When roughly 5,000 adults were randomly assigned to get free medicine or to pay nearly full price for their medicine. And their health and other behavior was tracked over a couple of years. And the basic effect was that the people who got free medicine consumed a lot more of it, say 30 to 40% more. And they just weren't any healthier if you look at 20 different health measures. More recently, there was an Oregon randomized health experiment, which found similar results in Oregon. Basically, this was among relatively poor people and whether they got free Medicaid. And we have a lot of other data on geographic variation, where we look at people living in different places and getting different levels of medical treatment because of where they live. And the geographic variation data also consistently shows that people who live in places where they do a lot more medicine aren't any healthier.
Is one way of interpreting this is that people, as a result of their expenditures, are actually improving their mental health, and that's maybe what they really want to try and do is avert the depression associated with
Well,
bad health conditions.
it feels good to show that you care about other people, and it feels good for other people to show they care about you. And at some level, if you don't believe that other people care about you, that's stressful and anxiety producing. And you might want to deal with that. The Oregon experiment also showed that when you give people money to cover their medical expenses, then they're less in debt and they feel less stressed about their finances.
Yeah.
Right? Which is a benefit, I guess. But again, it's just not a health benefit. It's not the thing they think they're doing.
One of the things that's just thinking on this idea of mental health is that it's clearly a big problem in society, and as I've gotten older, observing more, being more aware of the world, maybe observing more how mental health problems are terrible and incredibly detrimental to people's lives, maybe individually and in the aggregate. Is that kind of? Let me actually pause there and go back to another quote from the book, or go to a quote in the book, which I really thought about as I went back and reread the book, kind of with this in mind, where you say, nevertheless, we think that people can generally intuit what's good for them, even if they don't have an analytical understanding of why it's good for them. In particular, they have a keen sense for their concrete self-interest. For them, things are working out in their favor versus for when things are working out in their favor versus when they're getting a raw deal. And so there's an instinct here which needs to be acknowledged anyway, that there's something they're getting out of this. And so what do you think about what they're really getting out of healthcare? Is it just this reassurance?
Yeah, so just to be clear, we think that human behavior is really consistently well adapted to its environment, at least to its ancient environment. We may not be as good at making last minute changes to how the world has changed lately. So we are very intelligent and clever at doing things. And then we have these conscious thoughts about what we're doing and why. And these conscious thoughts are not actually that relevant for what we do. That is, we think we make a conscious plan and then follow the plan, but mostly we make conscious rationalizations for the things we're doing for other reasons that we don't even consciously understand. So most of this elephant in the brain is at this conscious level, at the level of the reasons we tell ourselves that we're doing things. And those reasons are just wrong compared to the reasons we actually have. But we're actually pretty good at following the actual reasons we have and implementing them. The disconnect comes when we try to explain what we're doing to ourselves or other people. So even in medicine, our habit of trying to take care of each other and show that we care about them and to be honestly appreciative and grateful when other people take care of us, that's functional for us. It bonds us to each other. It shows who our allies are, and that's a very important thing for a social species like us.
Maybe one of the other incredibly important ideas, maybe the most important idea, or the one that I enjoyed reading the most about, was this idea of status and how the hidden motivation that so often guides our actions is one of status seeking or status affirmation in comparison to other people. Do you mind just reflecting on that for a minute?
Well, I noticed that it's often something my economist colleagues were reluctant to talk about, even though once you push them over the edge, they kind of admit, well, it's obvious, everybody knows that. And that's true for a lot of the things we talk in our book. Either people are aghast and think that sounds crazy, or they say, there's nothing new there, everybody already knows this. And that's true for status. So we talk in our chapter on body language, for example, about how when any two people in the same room are interacting with each other, they have what are called status moves, whereby their body position and movements negotiate a relative status, and that actors have to learn how to do this so that they can seem realistic on stage or on the screen. But the people doing this are usually just completely unaware of this relative status and what it is and what moves they're making to create it, which is remarkable, really. It's very important to us, and we spend a lot of energy doing it. And we spend many years in school, for example, learning to talk and write. And yet we do all the status moves completely intuitively without much conscious thought, and we just mostly do it right.
And how does it relate to education? Specifically, education is such a enormous part of our lives, really. We spend so much time in it and so much energy working at it, or at least many of us do.
We're buying education. We're buying status with our education. People don't like to admit that, just because in general, foragers don't like to admit they're doing anything for status. They would prefer to admit they're doing things for prestige, but even then they'd prefer to admit that doing things just to help each other, etc. So Our standard story about why we go to school is to learn the material. It sounds like it's a good thing for society for more people to learn more material because they'll know more things and then to be more skilled at their jobs. And that all sounds like a very good pro-social sort of thing to do, except we're not actually learning very much. And what we do learn, we hardly use. But what we do is show that we're better than others at school. We could show that we're smarter, more conscientious, more conformist, know more of the social habits that we should have at the workplace. We're very effective in school at basically showing that we're better than other people, which is a kind of status. But we're less comfortable admitting that that's what we do in school. Now, many of us do admit that to some extent, but if you'll notice at graduation ceremonies, statements of purpose, etc., when economists or academics who study education, when they try to figure out how to reform education, they go to this idea that school is about learning the material, and they just focused on that as their main thing they're working on, to the exclusion of these other sorts of accounts of why we're going to school.
As I was reading it, I was reflecting back on my own education experience, call it secondary, primary education, and I have to confess I was a pretty lazy student, and thinking it, and I'm not at all about to try and suggest that I was immune to status-seeking behavior, surely not, but I'm thinking about I was wondering what kind of behavior it is to kind of play that game, or whether there's some sort of other game I was trying to play by rejecting it. There's something different about students who do work hard at school and then
Sure.
those kids who don't. So what do you think is going on? What was going on inside my head, deep in what was the elephant doing in my brain? Do you think?
Well, there's a nice academic paper by economists called "Too Cool for School," and it outlines the idea that often you can achieve an even higher status by showing that you can do okay in school without hardly working.
Right.
Yeah. So there are many ways to show off. School is only one of them. And even students who going to the same school, they often show off via their vocabulary, their wealth, their social connections, their time and our athletic abilities, etc. And school performance is only one of them. And there's a sense in which somebody who puts all their energy into school and then does well in school is lower status than other people who can get away with getting pretty good grades and hardly working at school, and therefore are able to spend their time on all these other things that are socially important to get them even higher status.
So education is just a platform for showing off your status or trying to gain status, I guess. Which is maybe why it's so valuable, like so many platform companies out there.
Well, it's privately valuable, at least. We can argue about the social value, whether we should all be subsidizing it, but clearly it's valuable for the individuals involved.
Yeah, one of the things too that my day job is I'm a manager, and so I'm hiring people, interviewing people all the time, and the thing that just frustrates me so much is actually how much energy I have to spend trying to figure out if somebody can actually do the job. And the signal that I get from the schools does work reasonably well, but I would definitely say it's not awesome. In particular,
right.
If I come across, so I'm an actuary and I'm hiring actuaries often, and you come across a new graduate who did a math degree where all the classes are graded on a curve, and looking at that, I hadn't really experienced that too much when I was going through university, but I genuinely don't know if they learned anything. I honestly don't know, and I wonder whether they learned anything sometimes.
Right, so you might give them a try and see how they work, and if they don't work out, get rid of them. But there's a lot of other people in the world you won't give a try because they don't have sufficient education. And when everybody knows that, they realize, well, I guess I need to get an education so that at least somebody like you will give me a try.
Sure, there's a self-reinforcing element to it, right? I mean,
absolutely.
How do you break that? Can we break that?
Well, first we'd want to. And so this is a key thing to understand about the elephant in the brain. Often when we talk about how to make the world better, we're not really very serious about it. And so what I've learned through my studies of social science for a long time is that we actually know a lot of ways to make the world better in the sense of giving us more of the things we say we want. And I think the main explanation for why people are so disinterested in reforms that social scientists produce is that they kind of know at some level that they don't actually want the things they've been saying they want. So they're not that interested in education systems that help people learn more material, or not that interested in medical systems that produce more health. And they're not that interested in political systems that create better policy, because that's mostly not their personal motivation in being involved in these things. And so yes, we can figure out ways to make things better, at least by some criteria, but the harder part is to make anybody care.
There's actually another set of ideas that I was expecting or hoping to see and didn't. I'm really interested to hear what you think of the links might be, and that is in Daniel Kahneman's work on cognitive bias, where he talks in his book on Thinking Fast and Slow about another hidden system inside our brain, the unconscious decision-making system of highly skilled people. In his book he talks about the fireman who walked into the burning down house and suddenly had this almost premonition that it was going to collapse and rushed out because he was just so highly trained. Is there a link somewhere between that unconscious system and the elephant in the brain?
Well, humans are enormously complicated, and the world is enormously complicated. So obviously, there's a lot of factors that influence and explain a lot of behavior. And even in terms of motives, almost everything we do, there can be a wide range of motives that are relevant, and there's averaging over people, there's probably a wide range of actual motives that are relevant. So when we talk about hidden motives, we're talking about the main strongest motive and saying it's larger and a different one than what other people have thought as the main strongest motive. But there's really a lot of motives and a lot of things going on everywhere. So there's a field of economics and another behavioral social science called behavioral economics, etc., that you're alluding to. And in this world, people often focus on a lot of these other factors and trying to explain behavior, and there's a lot going on there. But they don't tend to focus on sort of basic motives. And they tend to, present the world as if, well, it's just a complicated world where people just do all sorts of weird things because people are weird and the world's weird and it's all just complicated. And we're actually saying in this book that it's simpler than that. There are some simple hypotheses about what people's real motives are that help you understand a lot of their behaviors, even if it's complicated and quirky. And it's less about just knowing the specific quirks and complexities that particular people are prone to, and more about asking just what's fundamentally going on in each area.
There's one particular cognitive bias, and I forget the name that actually it is. Maybe you'll know. So I work in the insurance business, and one of the important characteristics of this business is it's a risk-taking business. And so what we do is you obviously undertake a financial arrangement whereby you pay the downside, and so all the distributions in this business are very heavily skewed, and the cost of a small slip-up tends to be pretty large. And so there's an interesting kind of self-deception which happens in our business where people pretend like the bad thing exists or is happening even when it's not. And so we accumulate all these risks in a portfolio of risks, and it's almost as though we walk around or have a culture of walking around thinking that the 70th percentile is true, and those who don't really lose all their money because they slip up, right? Because it's almost
right.
as though we're sort of pre-committing to being conservative in anticipation. Sort of this very layered kind of game that we play with ourselves. There's a colleague of mine who would tell a story where every year there's a management meeting at his company, and the CEO would berate the organization about how the standards are slipping, and oh my gosh, our company's gonna go out of business if we keep operating this way. And then the next day the finance guys would get up and they would go through the investor presentation, and sure enough, net assets go up by 10%, 12% every year, and actually they're succeeding. And so the culture is deliberately deceptive rather. And I'm wondering what you think of that, or are there other instances in life where we can use it to our advantage?
So in our book, we spend the first third of the book just talking about this general idea and why it might be plausible that we'd have hidden motives. And then the last 2/3 of the book are 10 different chapters where we go over specific areas of life and try to, in each area, say there's a usual story about our motives, here's some puzzles, and then here's a better explanation for motives. But these 10 chapters don't cover all of life. There's a lot of other things still to be investigated and understood about what our motives in different areas are. And this is clearly true for a lot of business life, including in your industry. Most of the time when people are doing something, there's a thing they're saying about why they're doing it, including going to a meeting or hiring someone. And then more plausibly, there are other reasons that are the real reasons. And we have to study each one of those things in detail to see what those other real reasons are. I could just mention just the very fact that people are buying insurance is puzzling.
Yeah,
in
sure.
the sense that the usual story about why people buy insurance is to reduce the risk, as you say. But in fact, there's very large risks people have that they're not at all interested in buying insurance against, and there are relatively small risks that people seem obsessed in buying insurance against. And that undercuts the theory that, in fact, what they're doing is trying to lower their risk. And so you have to start to consider some other hypotheses. Well, why are people buying some kinds of insurance and not others? And at some level, it looks like it's just often a social habit. That is, when other people around you buy a certain kind of insurance, then you seem like a responsible person if you buy that insurance, not even if it's a relatively modest risk. And if there's other risks around that nobody else is insuring around, if you start to try to insure against that, other people will look at you as being a weakling or insecure or insufficiently confident, and then you're discouraged from insuring other risks. So, at the very basic level, it's not why people buy insurance has hidden motives.
Oh, and I think many fewer people would buy it if they could get away with it. I mean, most insurance buying
required by law, yeah.
Absolutely, that's right. And auto insurance, workers' compensation insurance, and many other kinds, property insurance for your home if you get a mortgage. I mean, most things are forced. Most insurance purchases are forced upon us. And I think that there's the cognitive, Kahneman would say the cognitive bias at the heart of that is there's undervaluing the low probability events because you just figure they're not going to happen. And so, the government steps in to sort of stop that.
But even that may have other explanations. That is, the standard explanation for why any regulation happens or any government rules happens is, well, it's for our all general benefit. It makes us all better off. And, that's no doubt a motive, but it may well not be the main motive for a lot of these regulations.
Yeah, and I'm, of course, thinking back to the health insurance or the health care part of our conversation, right? I mean, that's
Absolutely.
Just a classic mess.
We have a huge requirement for health insurance or encouragement to get health insurance. And again, it's at least half of that is just wasted because we don't need that much health insurance because we don't need that much medicine.
I'm from Canada originally, where, of course, a very different system than here in the United States, where I've lived for 7 years. And even still, I still feel that the I don't know, from a personal standpoint, the somewhat longing for when you don't have to worry about the cost of healthcare, and of course that's an illusion that the government puts upon us, and they ration in other ways.
Right.
But it does feel nice.
You could think of that as just a craving for the people around you taking care of you.
Sure.
And that's the sort of forager instinct. You really wanted other people to take care of you and show that they cared about you. So think of the example of Valentine's chocolate. So when you buy a chocolate for somebody on Valentine's, you don't actually ask yourself how hungry they are and asking how much to buy. You ask, well, how big a box of chocolate or expensive a box of chocolate do I need to buy to distinguish myself from someone who doesn't care as much about me? Now, if you don't have somebody to buy chocolate about you, you might feel bad because you're all alone. People in that situation often buy themselves a box of chocolates so that they can, and leave it around the office or whatever, so they can show and feel like they were taken care of.
One kind of this idea I want to come back to yet again is sort of feeling out how and in what ways this hidden motivations are actually let's call it macroefficient. So what I mean by that is, in what ways are we better off because we have this? I mean, obviously the book is trying to illustrate the value of the idea by showing how much we can gain by reversing some of its effects, right? So if only we didn't have, healthcare felt this way, we could improve our lives by doing it. But are there ways in which it's actually really good and better off for having this?
Well, I mean, this is our nature, and so there's certainly a sense in which all of our mental capacities and everything else are built up around the habits of these sorts of pretend motives and real motives, and we would be somewhat lost even to think about how to deal with a world where we weren't behaving in this way. There would certainly be a period of adaptation required to change any of these things. But the first thing we want to say is just from an individual point of view, you're mostly better off, following the usual hypocrisy and not even being aware of your hidden motives, because that's how evolution seems to have built you, and that seems to be in your personal interest. Socially, collectively, we may be substantially worse off. We might be better off if we could all subsidize schools less and subsidize education less and many other things. But the problem is, how could we collectively get together to do that? In order to do that, we would have, especially in a democracy, we'd have to admit that this is what's going on to each other at a massive scale, and we just aren't very inclined to do that. And we just aren't inclined to actually deal with politics as if it was really about making the world better or even our country better. We talk that way. We talk as if, let's try to find a policy to make the country better, then let's try to advocate it. Let's get some group together. Let's lobby our politician. Let's elect politicians who will adopt a better policy. We talk that talk, but it's just not what's really going on in our hearts. That's not the thing that drives us and motivates us to be involved in politics. And so, in fact, there's a lot of ways to make the political system work better, and you could tell people about it and they can nod and say, yes, that makes sense, and they yawn and they quickly lose interest because it doesn't actually touch their real political motivations.
Can it be tweaked? I think that there's something else that I read, and gosh, I think I read it in something you wrote, where when you look at a system, the more general it is, the more similar it will look like to other systems that are trying to do the same thing, right? So I think that the example I read was like a pair of eyes. So if we found some aliens somewhere, their eyes would probably look like something like our eyes because they're all trying to achieve the same goal. And there's so many different things that eyes need to do that there's not really too many different ways that they could manifest themselves. So if you apply that idea to this the elephant in the brain and the way that we socialize and interact, maybe it exists this way because it's solving for so many different constraints and so many different things that we have to do through our social interactions that actually to try and change something might have unintended consequences somewhere else and sort of blow something up that we didn't expect.
Well, we're not claiming we have a grand solution to how everything should change in light of this. Our first claim is just that social scientists should be paying attention to this and taking it seriously. And until you do, we'll probably just be misdirected. So that's the first and strongest claim, is that the people who focus and study on social behavior and try to reform it, they should at least understand this. And then other people in society who are curious and wanting to understand what's really going on in their lives, they might want to know, although with the caution that evolution apparently built them not to know, and maybe they're better off not knowing. But there's a long road to go to try to build reforms to produce all this. But one thing we say in the conclusion is that the social reform design problem is harder than we had thought. So, for example, when we thought school was about learning the material, then we had to design ways to help people learn the material better, and that wasn't easy. But we've actually come up with a lot of those that people are just not very interested in. Now that people really want to show off their being smart, conscientious, etc., while pretending to learn the material. Now, if you want to come up with a reform design, you have to meet two constraints. You have to both continue to let people pretend to do the thing they want to pretend to be doing, and also offering them a better deal on the thing they're actually trying to get. That's harder to do. We social scientists are not practiced in that more complicated design problem. But if we can solve that one, we're much more likely to achieve some success in designing things that people would actually want if they were offered to them. But even then, of course, their attitudes in the political process might not induce them to want to bother to endorse it, even if it would help them. Because, again, the political instincts are really not about pushing better policy.
And so, what's the lowest hanging fruit, do you think? For a much more seasoned institution designer that you are now, where would you focus your attention?
The simplest things are just to cut things that are actually counterproductive. So subsidize medicine less, subsidize schools less, things like that. If we can't even do that, it's going to be much harder to come up with other more clever solutions. So the analysis suggests that those would make us better off. But the question is, can we admit that to ourselves in a public way that would be required to actually adopt those policies?
So we're running out of time here. I'd like to just kind of close with maybe you have an ask of the audience. What's something that people can do to try and further this? It sounds like a big old problem. How can we help?
Well, so I think you should just pause and ask yourself, two questions like, how important does this sound on the surface? Like, am I making like some minor little correction, or is this a big deal? And I think you'll agree with me that this, if I'm correct, this is a really big deal. And the second question to ask yourself is, how much do you care? And I'm afraid you'll often find that you kind of shrug your shoulders and say, yeah, but I don't care. Because it's not very pleasant to look at the elephant in the brain. It's something we're trying to look away from, and we're trying not to see. And so we're actually emotionally looking for any excuse to look away. And so as soon as this podcast is over, you may quickly want to look away and find something else to look at, which is fine if your job isn't to be understanding human behavior and reforming institutions. But if your job is in some way you see as trying to understand the world well enough to design reforms to improve it, then my ask is that you overcome your emotional reluctance to look at the elephant in the brain and realize that this is a big, important topic, and make yourself pay attention.
My guest today is Robin Hanson. Robin, your book comes out in January, is that right?
That's right.
Available anywhere people want to look, at Amazon. Where can they get it?
It'll be out from Oxford, but it'll be, yes, available most everywhere.
Great. Blogs at overcomingbias.com. Robin, thank you very much for being part of the show.
Thanks so much for having me.